The harbor auction reeked of salt, sweat, and desperation. Among crates of stolen goods and captured treasures, a skeletal puppy lay chained to a rotting post, its ribs showing through matted fur. The crowd jeered as the auctioneer declared it worthless cargo from a sunken merchant vessel. Captain Marcus, Blackwater Thorne, watched from the shadows, his weathered face betraying nothing. This was a man who had sailed treacherous waters for 20 years, who commanded respect through fear and cunning. His crew knew him as ruthless, calculating, someone who never showed weakness. When the auctioneer moved to toss the dying pup into the harbor, something stirred in Marcus's chest. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden dock. "I need a friend, you need food," he said quietly, placing his last silver coin on the table. But what happens when the most feared pirate captain discovers that saving one small life might be the key to saving his own soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crew of the Crimson Tide watched in stunned silence as their captain climbed aboard with the skeletal creature cradled against his chest. First Mate Torres crossed himself, muttering prayers in Spanish that hadn't passed his lips since childhood. The other men shuffled their feet, exchanging glances that spoke of confusion and barely concealed mockery. "Captain's gone soft," whispered Jenkins. The ship's cook, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the other sailors. Spending his last coin on a dying Marcus heard the whispers, but said nothing. He had learned long ago that true authority came, not from responding to every slight, but from the steady demonstration of will. The puppy in his arms weighed no more than a sack of grain, its breathing shallow and irregular. Each exhale might be its last. Yet something in the creature's eyes held a spark that reminded Marcus of himself many years ago. His quarters occupied the stern of the ship, a space that reflected the contradictions of his nature. Maps and charts covered one wall, marking routes through treacherous waters and the locations of successful raids. Yet beside them hung a small oil painting of a cottage by the sea, a reminder of dreams he had abandoned decades ago. His desk, carved from mahogany taken from a Spanish galleon, held his worn leather journal alongside a collection of books that revealed an educated mind beneath the pirate's exterior. Marcus set the puppy gently on his bunk, the finest linens on the ship now serving as a sickbed for a creature worth nothing to any reasonable man. He opened his journal to a fresh page, the leather binding soft from years of handling. His handwriting, firm and precise, revealed an education that seemed at odds with his chosen profession. August 15th, 1723. Today I did something that defies all logic and reason. I saved a dying animal with money I could not afford to spend. The crew thinks I have lost my mind, and perhaps they are correct. Yet when I looked into that creature's eyes, I saw something I had forgotten existed: hope. The puppy stirred, its eyes opening to fix on Marcus's face. For a moment, captain and animal regarded each other in silence. Marcus had stared down naval officers and rival pirates without flinching, but this small creature's gaze unsettled him in ways he could not explain. He retrieved a bowl from his personal stores and filled it with fresh water, kneeling beside the bunk to offer it to his unexpected guest. The puppy's tongue was dry and cracked, but it managed a few tentative laps before exhaustion claimed it again. A soft knock interrupted his ministrations. Torres entered without waiting for permission, a liberty he had earned through 15 years of loyal service. The first mate's weathered face showed concern rather than judgment, though his expression suggested questions that demanded answers. "Captain," Torres said quietly, "the men are talking. They don't understand why you would risk our position for a dying animal." Marcus continued stroking the puppy's matted fur, his movements gentle despite hands that had wielded cutlass and pistol with deadly precision. "Torres, do you remember when we found you in that prison in Tortuga?" The first mate's expression softened, half dead and forgotten by the world. "Yet I saw something in you worth saving, something the guards and other prisoners had missed." Marcus met his old friend's eyes. Sometimes the most valuable treasures come disguised as worthless cargo. Torres nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. He had served under captains who measured everything by its immediate value, who would have left him to rot in that cell. Marcus's willingness to see potential where others saw only burden had saved Torres's life and given it new meaning. "What will you call him?" Torres asked, surprising himself with the question. Marcus paused, his hand stilling on the puppy's thin frame. He had not considered a name, had not allowed himself to believe the creature would survive long enough to need one. Yet, already he found himself thinking of the animal not as it, but as a presence with its own identity and worth. "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted. "First, we must see if he chooses to stay with us." Torres smiled, recognizing the captain's careful way of expressing hope without admitting vulnerability. "I'll have Jenkins prepare some broth, something gentle for his stomach." As his first mate left, Marcus returned his attention to the journal. His pen moved slowly across the page, recording thoughts he would share with no one else. "The creature weighs nothing, yet already I feel the burden of responsibility for its life. Strange how caring for something so small can make a man feel both weaker and stronger at once." 3 days passed before the puppy showed signs of true recovery. Marcus had taken to spending long hours in his quarters, abandoning his usual practice of prowling the deck to ensure discipline and order. The crew noticed this change, though none dared comment directly to their captain's face. The animal had managed to consume Jenkins's carefully prepared broth and even a few pieces of softened biscuit. Its eyes, once dull with approaching death, now tracked Marcus's movements with growing interest. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Life was returning to the small body that had nearly surrendered to starvation and neglect. Marcus found himself facing an unexpected dilemma. The creature needed a name, but choosing one felt like a commitment he was not certain he was prepared to make. Names carried weight, created bonds that could become vulnerabilities. Pirates learned early to avoid attachments that might compromise their judgment or resolve. Yet every time he looked at the puppy struggling to stand on unsteady legs or attempting to follow him across the cabin, Marcus felt something shifting inside his chest. The walls he had built around his heart over 20 years at sea seemed to be developing cracks. On the 4th morning, while cleaning his quarters, Marcus discovered something he had not seen in months. His sea chest, massive and iron-bound, contained more than charts and weapons. Hidden beneath layers of practical possessions lay a small wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. Inside the box rested his mother's locket, a simple piece of silver that had survived battles, storms, and the countless hardships of pirate life. He had not opened it since the day he learned of her death, 5 years earlier. The news had reached him in Port Royal through a letter that took months to find him, delivered by a merchant who knew his reputation but not his history. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing a miniature portrait of Eleanor Hope Thorne, painted when she was young and full of dreams for her son's future. She had named him Marcus after his grandfather, but her middle name, Hope, had always been special to them both. She used to tell him that hope was the only treasure that could never be stolen, lost, or destroyed. Marcus stared at the portrait, remembering her voice and the way she used to sing while working in their small garden. She had died alone in a charity ward, her son too distant and too proud to return home in time to comfort her. Final days. The guilt had driven him to darker waters and more desperate raids, as if violence could somehow balance the scales of his regret. The puppy, stronger now, approached Marcus's chair with careful steps. It seemed to sense the change in his mood, the weight of memories that pressed down on the cabin like fog rolling in from the sea. Without hesitation, the small animal placed its head against Marcus's knee, offering the only comfort it could provide. "Hope," Marcus said quietly, the name emerging from some deep place he had tried to seal away. "Your name is Hope." The puppy's tail attempted a weak wag, as if approving the choice. Marcus reached down to stroke the animal's head, noting how the fur had begun to regain some luster under his care. Hope was still thin, still fragile, but no longer dying. The transformation reminded Marcus of his mother's faith in redemption, her belief that every living thing deserved a chance to become something better. That evening, Torres knocked on the cabin door carrying a small bowl of scraps from the galley. He found Marcus and Hope sitting together near the stern windows, watching the sunset paint the Caribbean waters in shades of gold and crimson. "The crew wants to know the dog's name," Torres said, settling the bowl on the deck where Hope could reach it. "They're starting to place bets on how long it will survive." "Her name is Hope," Marcus replied, not taking his eyes from the water. "And she's going to survive." Torres noted the certainty in his captain's voice, the way he said her instead of it. The first mate had served under Marcus long enough to recognize the signs of deep commitment. When their captain made such declarations, they typically became reality through sheer force of will. "The men are curious about your attachment," Torres said carefully. "Some are wondering if this changes anything about how we operate." Marcus turned from the window to face his oldest friend. "Tell the men that Hope is now part of this crew. Anyone who has a problem with that arrangement can find another ship at our next port." Hope finished eating and curled up beside Marcus's chair, her breathing steady and peaceful. The sight of the recovering animal brought an unexpected peace to the captain's usually restless mind. The storm struck without warning, as Caribbean tempests often do. One moment the crimson tide sailed under clear skies, the next she was fighting for survival against walls of water that towered above her mainmast. The ship's compass spun wildly in its housing, the needle dancing between directions, as if touched by madness. Marcus emerged from his cabin as the first winds hit, Hope pressed against his chest beneath his heavy coat. The crew scrambled across the deck, their movements practiced, but desperate as they fought to secure rigging and batten down anything that might become a projectile in the growing chaos. "All hands on deck," Torres shouted over the howling wind, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "Secure the mainsail before she tears herself apart." The ship lurched violently to port, sending several crew members sliding across the rain-slicked deck. Marcus grabbed the wheel from the helmsman, his experienced hands feeling the ship struggle against forces that could crush her like driftwood. Hope whimpered against his chest, but remained still, as if understanding that any movement might distract him from the desperate work of keeping them alive. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating mountainous waves that crashed over the bow with crushing force. The compass housing cracked under the ship's violent motion, its brass needle spinning uselessly as saltwater invaded the delicate mechanism. Without reliable navigation, they were sailing blind through waters that could dash them against hidden reefs or drive them into the path of other vessels. "Captain," Jenkins called from the rigging, his voice high with fear. "The mainsail's tearing. We're going to lose her." Marcus felt Hope's small body trembling against him, but when he looked down, he saw not naivety but trust in her dark eyes. Something about her presence calmed the storm of panic that usually accompanied such crises. His mind, typically racing with calculations and contingencies, settled into a strange clarity. "Cut the mainsail loose," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Let the storm take it. Torres, bring us around to port. We'll run before the wind." The crew stared at him in shock. Running before the wind in a storm of this magnitude was tantamount to suicide. Ships that tried such maneuvers typically found themselves driven onto rocks or capsized by following seas. Yet something in Marcus's manner suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. Hope lifted her head from his chest, her nose testing the wind. Her ears, still small and fragile, pricked forward as if she could hear something beyond the storm's roar. Marcus found himself watching her reactions, using her senses to supplement his own damaged instruments. The ship came around slowly, her bow now pointing away from the storm's heart. The motion felt wrong to every sailor's instinct. They were surrendering control to the very forces that threatened to destroy them. Yet as the crimson tide settled into her new heading, the violent pitching began to ease. "She's steadying, Captain," Torres called, disbelief evident in his voice. "The strain on the hull is lessening." Marcus nodded, still holding Hope close as he guided the ship through waters that seemed determined to claim them. The puppy's presence had somehow allowed him to think beyond the immediate terror, to find a solution that his experience alone might have missed. Her trust in him had become his trust in himself. The storm raged for 6 more hours, testing every timber and rope on the ship. Crew members, who had initially mocked their captain's attachment to a worthless animal, now watched Hope with growing respect. The dog seemed to sense changes in the weather before the men could detect them, her behavior serving as an early warning system that helped them adjust their efforts accordingly. When dawn finally broke, the Crimson Tide found herself in calm waters, battered but intact. The crew emerged from whatever shelter they had found, their faces showing the exhaustion and relief of men who had looked death in the eye and survived. The broken compass lay forgotten on the deck, its failure having forced them to rely on instincts they had nearly forgotten. Marcus stood at the bow with Hope in his arms, both of them watching the sunrise paint the Caribbean in shades of gold and pink. The puppy had grown stronger during their ordeal, as if the storm had somehow completed her recovery. Her coat, once dull and matted, now showed hints of the rich brown and white pattern that would mark her adult appearance. "Well, girl," Marcus murmured, scratching behind her ears, "it seems we make a good team." Hope responded with a small bark, her first vocal sound since coming aboard. The crew members within earshot smiled, despite their exhaustion, recognizing that their ship had gained more than just a mascot. She had become their good luck charm, their guide through troubled waters. Port Royal sprawled before them like a fever dream of civilization, its docks crowded with vessels from every corner of the Caribbean. The smell of spices, rum, and unwashed bodies drifted across the water, mixing with the eternal scent of salt and tar that marked every major port. Marcus stood at the rail with Hope beside him, both studying the bustling harbor that represented both opportunity and danger. "Stay close to Torres while I'm ashore," Marcus told Hope, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. She had grown considerably in the weeks since the storm, her coat now thick and glossy, her eyes bright with intelligence. The crew had taken to feeding her scraps and teaching her simple commands, though she remained most devoted to her rescuer. The wanted poster caught Marcus's attention as soon as he stepped onto the dock. His own face stared back at him from rough paper nailed to a tavern wall, the reward offering enough gold to tempt even loyal friends. Captain Marcus Blackwater Thorne, wanted for piracy, murder, and crimes against the crown. The amount had increased since his last visit to civilized waters. Hope had remained aboard as ordered, but Marcus felt her absence like a physical ache. Strange how quickly he had grown accustomed to her presence, the way she seemed to anticipate his moods and offer comfort without being asked. The crew teased him about his attachment, but their jests carried affection rather than mockery now. His business in Port Royal was simple enough: provisions for the crew and information about shipping lanes that might prove profitable. Yet moving through the crowded streets required constant vigilance. Too many people knew his face, and the bounty on his head would feed a family for years. Back at the ship, Hope paced the deck restlessly. Torres watched her with growing concern as she whined and stared toward shore. The dog had never shown such agitation before, her usual calm demeanor replaced by an anxiety that seemed to infect the entire crew. "Easy, girl," Torres murmured, offering her a piece of dried meat. Hope sniffed it politely but showed no interest in eating. Instead, she positioned herself at the gangplank, her body tense with alertness. The trouble arrived in the form of 3 men who approached the Crimson Tide with the swagger of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Their leader, a scarred brute named Blackwood, had sailed with Marcus years earlier before a disagreement over the treatment of prisoners ended their association violently. Well, Blackwood called as he swaggered up the gangplank, ignoring Torres's attempt to block his path. "If it isn't the famous Captain Thorne's ship, though I don't see the captain himself." Hope's hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in her throat. The sound surprised the boarding party, who had expected to find only sailors and easily intimidated crew members. The dog's protective stance and bared teeth suggested she was prepared to defend the ship regardless of the odds. "Captain's ashore on business," Torres replied carefully, his hand resting on his cutlass. "And this is a private vessel. You have no business here." Blackwood laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "I have business wherever I choose to make it, old man. Heard tell Thorne's gotten soft in his old age, taking in strays and playing nursemaid to dying animals. Hope's growl deepened, her small body coiled with tension. Though she weighed perhaps 30 pounds, something in her manner suggested she would not back down from a fight, regardless of the size of her opponents. The confrontation escalated quickly. Blackwood's men spread out across the deck, their intentions clear even without spoken threat. They had come to loot what they could, and perhaps settle old scores with Marcus's crew. What they had not expected was resistance from a dog who had already learned that the Crimson Tide was worth defending. Hope launched herself at Blackwood's lead man as he reached for Torres's sword. Her attack was swift and precise, her teeth finding the tender flesh of his wrist before he could react. The man screamed and stumbled backward, his blood spattering the deck as he tried to shake off the determined animal. "Kill that damned cur," Blackwood roared, drawing his own blade, but Hope's courage had inspired the crew. Seeing their smallest member willing to fight against overwhelming odds, the sailors found their own backbone. Torres's cutlass sang from its sheath, followed by a dozen others, as the Crimson Tide's crew rallied to defend their ship. The battle was brief, but vicious. Hope darted between the combatants, harassing Blackwood's men and creating openings for the crew to exploit. Her presence seemed to unnerve the attackers, who had expected to face demoralized sailors, not a coordinated defense led by a fearless dog. When Marcus returned an hour later, he found Hope sitting proudly beside Torres, her muzzle still stained with an enemy's blood. The attempted boarding had been repelled, and word was already spreading through Port Royal that Captain Thorne's ship was protected by more than just human loyalty. The merchant vessel Santa Isabella wallowed in the Caribbean swells like a wounded whale, her cargo holds heavy with gold bound for Spain. Marcus studied her through his spyglass from a distance that allowed observation without detection. The ship flew Portuguese colors, but her lines suggested Dutch construction, a common deception in waters where nationality could mean the difference between safe passage and pirate attack. 18 guns, Torres observed, lowering his own glass, but her crew looked small for a vessel that size, probably relying on speed rather than firepower. Hope sat beside Marcus at the rail, her eyes tracking the distant ship with the same intensity her master showed. She had grown into her adult form over the past months, her brown and white coat gleaming in the tropical sun. The crew had taken to calling her their first mate's first mate, acknowledging her position in the ship's hierarchy. The attack came at dawn, the Crimson Tide emerging from the morning mist like a predator materializing from dreams. The merchant vessel's crew scrambled to respond, but their lack of experience showed in every clumsy movement. Within an hour, the Santa Isabella struck her colors and prepared to receive boarders. Marcus crossed between ships with Hope at his side, her presence now as natural to him as breathing. The crew of the captured vessel huddled on deck under the watchful eyes of Torres and his men, their faces showing the resigned terror of civilians caught in circumstances beyond their control. "Captain," Torres called from the ship's stern cabin, "you need to see this." Marcus found his first mate standing guard over a young woman who sat with perfect composure despite her obvious captivity. Isabella Mendoza possessed the kind of beauty that painters struggled to capture. Dark eyes that held intelligence and spirit, hair like polished ebony, and a bearing that suggested nobility rather than mere wealth. Around her neck hung an emerald necklace that caught the light filtering through the cabin windows. The stones were perfectly matched, their green fire speaking of mines in distant lands and craftsmen who understood their art. Such jewelry belonged in royal treasuries, not around the neck of a merchant's daughter, traveling the dangerous waters of the Caribbean. "Señorita Isabella Mendoza," Torres announced with uncharacteristic formality, "daughter of Don Carlos Mendoza, the spice merchant of Cartagena." Hope approached the young woman cautiously, her instincts reading the complex emotions that filled the cabin. Instead of the fear or anger that usually marked captives, Isabella showed curiosity as she studied the dog, who moved with such confidence beside the pirate captain. "You're not what I expected," Isabella said quietly, addressing Marcus directly despite the danger such boldness might invite. Her English carried only the faintest accent, suggesting an education that extended far beyond the usual accomplishments of merchant daughters. "What did you expect?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her answer. "Someone crueler," she replied, her eyes moving between Marcus and Hope. "The stories they tell in Cartagena paint pirates as monsters, without conscience or mercy. Yet you travel with a companion who suggests otherwise." Hope had settled beside Isabella's chair, close enough to offer comfort, but not so near as to seem threatening. The dog's presence appeared to calm the young woman in ways that surprised both Torres and Marcus. Animals possessed instincts about human nature that often proved more reliable than reason. "Hope has excellent judgment about people," Marcus said, noting how naturally the dog had accepted their prisoner. "She's rarely wrong in her assessment." Isabella smiled for the first time since the capture, her hand moving tentatively toward Hope's head. When the dog accepted her touch, something shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. Fear remained, but it no longer dominated the space. "Your father's cargo manifest lists spices and cloth," Torres reported, consulting papers taken from the ship's strongbox. "But the actual holds contain something more valuable." Marcus examined the documents with growing interest. Don Carlos Mendoza was more than a simple spice merchant. He was a financier whose network extended throughout the Spanish colonies. The Santa Isabella carried not just goods, but correspondence that revealed the movements of treasure fleets and the locations of wealthy settlements. "This information could be worth more than any cargo we might steal," Marcus murmured, his mind calculating possibilities. Isabella watched him study the papers, her expression unreadable. "My father trusted me with knowledge of his business operations," she said carefully. "Perhaps we might reach an arrangement that benefits both parties." The suggestion intrigued Marcus more than it should have. Traditionally, prisoners were held for ransom or released after being stripped of valuables, but Isabella's offer suggested complications that went beyond simple piracy. Hope rose from beside Isabella's chair and moved to Marcus, pressing against his leg in a gesture that had become familiar. The dog's behavior suggested approval of the young woman, though whether that approval extended to her proposal remained unclear. The emerald necklace caught the light again as Isabella shifted in her chair, its beauty a reminder of the wealth that flowed through Caribbean waters like blood through veins. Such treasures had built empires and destroyed kingdoms, their possession marking the difference between power and obscurity. The grumbling started in the ship's galley and spread through the crew like fever. Marcus could feel the change in atmosphere aboard the Crimson Tide, the way conversations died when he approached and resumed in hushed tones after he passed. Hope sensed it too, staying closer to his side and watching the crew with alert eyes that missed nothing. 20 years I've sailed with hard men," Garrett muttered to his messmates, his voice carrying just far enough to ensure others heard. "Never seen a captain go soft over a woman and a dog." Jenkins nodded agreement as he stirred the evening stew. "Used to be we'd take what we wanted and be done with it. Now we're running a passenger service for Spanish nobility." The criticism stung because it carried elements of truth that Marcus could not easily dismiss. Isabella had been aboard for 2 weeks, occupying the spare cabin with a courtesy typically reserved for paying passengers rather than captives. Her meals came from Marcus's own stores, and she moved about the ship with a freedom that scandalized the crew. Hope had adopted Isabella completely, spending hours in her company and serving as an informal guard that made the crew's resentment more complex. The dog they had come to love was clearly devoted to the woman they increasingly viewed as a threat to their captain's judgment. Torres found Marcus on deck as the sun set, painting the Caribbean in shades of gold and crimson. The first mate's weathered face showed the strain of managing a crew whose respect for their captain was slowly eroding. "We need to talk," Torres said quietly, ensuring their conversation remained private. Marcus gestured toward his quarters, where they could speak without being overheard. Hope followed automatically, her presence a reminder of how much had changed since that day in the harbor auction. The dog settled beside Marcus's chair, as if claiming her position in whatever discussion was about to unfold. "The men are losing faith," Torres said without preamble. "They signed on to sail with Captain Blackwater Thorne, not some lovesick merchant who negotiates with prisoners." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His reputation had been built on decisive action and ruthless efficiency, qualities that seemed to have deserted him in recent weeks. The crew's discontent threatened not just his authority, but the survival of everyone aboard. "What are they saying specifically?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. "That you've lost your edge, that the dog and the woman have made you weak." Torres paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some are talking about finding new berths at our next port." Marcus's ceremonial cutlass hung on the wall beside his charts, its blade bearing the scratches of countless battles. The weapon symbolized his authority aboard the Crimson Tide, but symbols meant nothing if the men no longer respected the man who wielded them. Hope lifted her head, her ears pricked toward the door. Footsteps approached through the corridor, too heavy and deliberate to belong to Isabella. Marcus recognized Garrett's stride, aggressive and purposeful in a way that suggested confrontation. The knock came with barely restrained force. "Captain, we need words with you." Marcus exchanged glances with Torres, who nodded grimly. This moment had been inevitable since Isabella came aboard, though it arrived sooner than either man had hoped. Authority challenged must be defended, or it ceased to exist. "Enter," Marcus called, his voice carrying the steel that had once cowed enemies and inspired loyalty. Garrett entered with 3 other crew members, their faces showing the determination of men who had decided to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. Hope rose from her position beside Marcus's chair, her body tense with awareness of the changed dynamics in the room. "Captain," Garrett began, his voice carefully respectful but firm, "the crew has concerns about how this ship is being run." Plainly, Marcus replied, though he knew the directness might escalate the confrontation beyond peaceful resolution. "The Spanish woman has been aboard for 2 weeks without ransom demand or release. The men think you've forgotten what we are and why we sail these waters." Garrett's courage grew as he spoke, fed by the agreement he saw in his companions' faces. "We signed on to serve a pirate captain, not a merchant who keeps pets and prisoners as passengers." The accusation hung in the cabin air like smoke from cannon fire. Marcus felt the weight of 20 years' reputation balanced on his response to this challenge. Too harsh, and he would prove their point about his changed nature. Too soft, and he would lose their respect entirely. Hope moved between Marcus and the confronting crew members, her position clearly protective, despite the overwhelming odds. The sight of the small dog, prepared to defend him against his own men, struck Marcus as both touching and ridiculous. "And what would you have me do with our guest?" Marcus asked, his tone dangerously quiet. "Ransom her or release her," Garrett replied boldly. "Stop treating her like visiting royalty." The tension in Marcus's cabin could have been cut with a blade. Garrett and his companions stood their ground, waiting for their captain's response to challenges that could not be ignored or dismissed. Hope remained positioned between the opposing groups, her small body radiating protective instincts that seemed almost comical given the gravity of the situation. Marcus rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. The leather-bound book of pirate codes lay open on his desk, its pages yellowed with age and stained with salt spray from countless voyages. The ancient rules governed everything from division of spoils to resolution of disputes, including challenges to a captain's authority. "You question my decisions," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that preceded storms. "By pirate law, such challenges must be resolved formally." Garrett's face paled slightly as he realized the implications of his words. The pirate code offered only 2 solutions for crew members who openly defied their captain's authority: departure at the next port or trial by combat. There was no middle ground for such fundamental disagreement. "Captain," Torres interjected, Recognizing the direction of the conversation, perhaps we can resolve this through discussion rather than formal challenge. Marcus shook his head, his eyes never leaving Garrett's face. The code is clear. When crew members openly question their captain's fitness to command, the matter must be settled definitively. Hope whined softly, sensing the escalating danger in the room. Her instincts told her that violence was approaching, though she could not understand the human rituals that seemed to make such conflict inevitable. "I invoke the right of trial by blade," Marcus declared, his words carrying the weight of irrevocable decision. "Garrett has challenged my authority publicly. By the code that governs our brotherhood, he must now defend his position with steel." The other crew members stepped back, leaving Garrett alone to face the consequences of his boldness. The man's courage had carried him this far, but now he faced the reality of crossing swords with a captain whose reputation was built on surviving exactly such encounters. Isabella appeared in the doorway, drawn by voices raised in anger. She took in the scene quickly, the open book of codes, the positioning of the men, the ceremonial cutlass that Marcus now lifted from its mount on the wall. Her presence added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. "This is because of me," she said quietly, her voice carrying guilt and regret. "I never intended to cause division among your crew." Marcus tested the balance of his blade, its familiar weight settling into his palm like an old friend returning from a long journey. "This has nothing to do with you, señorita. It concerns the fundamental question of who commands this vessel." The deck outside had grown crowded as word spread through the ship. Duels between captains and crew members were rare enough to draw every available man to witness the outcome. The circle formed automatically, creating space for combat while ensuring no one could claim ignorance of the results. Hope followed Marcus onto the deck, her anxiety visible in every line of her body. She had never seen her master engage in formal combat, though she sensed the deadly seriousness that marked this encounter as different from the battles she had witnessed during ship raids. Garrett drew his own blade with hands that trembled slightly. He was a competent fighter, experienced in the brutal realities of pirate life. But he had never faced an opponent of Marcus's caliber in single combat. The captain's reputation for sword work was legendary throughout the Caribbean. "By the ancient code," Torres announced formally, "let this dispute be settled by blade and blood. The victor commands. The defeated yields or dies." The first clash of steel rang across the water like a bell tolling. Marcus fought with the precision of long experience, his blade work economical and deadly. Garrett struggled to match his captain's skill, but the difference in their abilities became apparent within moments. Hope circled the combatants, her agitation growing with each exchange of blows. When Garrett's blade found its mark, opening a shallow cut on Marcus's sword arm, the dog's protective instincts overcame her training. She launched herself at Garrett with a fierce growl, her teeth seeking the hand that held the weapon threatening her master. "No hope," Marcus commanded, but his momentary distraction allowed Garrett to press his advantage. The crew watched in stunned silence as their smallest member intervened in a formal duel, her loyalty transcending the ancient rules that governed such encounters. Isabella stepped forward as if to call the dog back, but Torres caught her arm. "Let them finish it," he said grimly. "This has gone too far for half measures." The duel's outcome surprised no one, though Hope's intervention had briefly tilted the odds. Marcus's blade found its mark with surgical precision, and Garrett fell to the deck, clutching a wound that would heal, but leave him forever marked by his failed challenge. The weeks following Garrett's challenge brought an uneasy peace to the Crimson Tide. The crew's respect for Marcus had been restored through steel and blood, but the underlying tensions remained like embers waiting for fresh kindling. Isabella had witnessed the violence her presence could inspire, yet she remained aboard with a grace that gradually won over even the most resistant sailors. Hope had appointed herself guardian of both Marcus and Isabella, moving between them throughout the day as if ensuring their safety required constant vigilance. The dog's devotion to both humans created a bridge that neither captain nor prisoner had expected, allowing conversations that might otherwise have been impossible. In the privacy of his cabin, Marcus found himself studying Isabella with growing fascination. She possessed an intelligence that matched her beauty, discussing navigation and trade routes with knowledge that surprised him. Her education extended far beyond the usual accomplishments of merchant daughters, suggesting a mind prepared for responsibilities that transcended domestic concern. "My father believes women should understand the businesses that support their families," Isabella explained one evening. As they shared dinner, Hope lay between their chairs, content to be near both humans while they talked. "Knowledge is the only inheritance that cannot be stolen or lost through misfortune." Marcus nodded, remembering his own mother's practical wisdom. "Your father sounds like a wise man, wise enough to know that pirates are not always the monster stories make them," Isabella replied, her eyes meeting his across the table. "You could have treated me far differently than you have." The acknowledgement hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to address directly. Marcus had indeed treated her with a courtesy that defied every principle of successful piracy, yet he found himself unable to regret the decision. Isabella reached into her bodice and withdrew a folded paper, its edges worn from handling. "I have something that might interest you," she said carefully, unfolding what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "My father's routes include places where Spanish treasure ships rest after storms." The map showed coastlines Marcus recognized, but marked with symbols that indicated hidden anchorages and supply caches used by merchant vessels during dangerous weather. Such information could be worth more than any single cargo they might capture, providing intelligence about Spanish shipping patterns that could guide future raids. "Why would you share this with me?" Marcus asked, though he studied the map with obvious interest. "Because I believe you are not the same man who began this voyage," Isabella replied honestly. "The captain who saved a dying dog might be willing to consider alternatives to simple piracy." Hope lifted her head at the mention of her rescue, her tail offering a tentative wag, as if she understood the significance of that moment. The dog's presence reminded both humans of the capacity for change that had brought them together in circumstances none of them could have predicted. Marcus traced the routes marked on Isabella's map, his experienced eye calculating distances and identifying strategic advantages. The information could indeed transform his operations, allowing him to intercept Spanish treasure ships with unprecedented precision. Yet accepting the map would create obligations that extended beyond simple theft. "What would you want in return for this intelligence?" Marcus asked, suspecting the answer would complicate his life in ways he might not be prepared to handle. "Safe passage to Tortuga," Isabella replied, "and your promise that this knowledge will not be used to harm innocent merchants like my father." The request seemed reasonable on its surface, but Marcus recognized the deeper implication. Isabella was asking him to distinguish between legitimate targets and innocent traders, to exercise judgment rather than simply taking whatever prizes opportunity presented. Such discrimination would require him to become something other than a traditional pirate. Hope rose from her position between the chairs and moved to the cabin windows, her attention focused on something beyond the glass. Her ears pricked forward with alert interest, suggesting she had detected sounds or movements that warranted investigation. Marcus joined her at the windows, peering into the darkness that surrounded the crimson tide. The Caribbean night revealed little beyond the gentle phosphorescence of disturbed water and the distant glitter of stars reflected on calm seas. Yet Hope's continued alertness suggested dangers that human senses might miss. "What is it, girl?" Marcus murmured, trusting the dog's instincts more than his own eyes. The answer came as a flash of lantern light in the distance, quickly extinguished but unmistakable in its significance. Another vessel was approaching under cover of darkness, its intentions unknown but certainly not peaceful. Ships that traveled without lights typically had reasons to avoid detection. Isabella moved to Marcus's side, her own eyes searching the darkness for signs of the approaching threat. "Spanish patrol?" she asked quietly. "Possibly," Marcus replied, his mind already calculating responses to various scenarios. "Or pirates, looking for easy prey." Hope's low growl suggested the approaching vessel carried hostile intentions, regardless of its national allegiance or official purpose. The approaching vessel revealed itself at dawn, flying British naval colours that snapped proudly in the morning breeze. HMS Retribution was a ship of the line, her 36 guns and disciplined crew representing everything that made the Royal Navy the terror of pirates throughout the Caribbean. Her captain, James Worthington, had built his reputation on the systematic destruction of pirate vessels and the public execution of their crews. Marcus studied the warship through his spyglass, noting details that confirmed his worst suspicion. The Retribution flew a false merchant flag beneath her naval colors, the classic deception used to lure pirates into attacking what appeared to be easy prey. Isabella's presence aboard the Crimson Tide had been reported, and the Royal Navy had set an elaborate trap using her as bait. "She's positioning to cut off our escape route to open water," Torres observed, his own glass trained on the warship's movements. "They know exactly where we are and what we're carrying." Hope stood at the rail beside Marcus, her body tense with awareness of the danger that surrounded them. The dog had learned to read her master's moods with uncanny accuracy, and his current state of controlled alarm communicated itself to her through subtle changes in posture and breathing. Isabella joined them on deck, her face pale with understanding of what the warship's appearance meant for everyone aboard. "Captain Worthington," she said quietly, recognizing the vessel from her father's descriptions of naval patrols. "He's known for taking no prisoners." The implication struck Marcus like physical blows. Isabella's capture had not been the random stroke of luck he had assumed. Her father, Don Carlos Mendoza, had arranged for his daughter to be aboard that merchant vessel, knowing pirates would likely attack it. The Royal Navy had been alerted to expect exactly such an encounter, with Isabella serving as both bait and witness to whatever followed. "You knew," Marcus said, his voice carrying dangerous quiet as he turned to face Isabella. "Your father planned this entire encounter." Isabella's expression showed genuine shock at the accusation. "No, I swear to you, I had no knowledge of any such plan. My father would never use me as bait for such a trap." Hope whined softly, sensing the tension between the two humans she had come to love. The dog's distress reflected the confusion that gripped everyone aboard as they realized their situation might not be what it appeared. Torres interrupted their confrontation with urgent news. "Captain, the Retribution is signaling for us to heave to and prepare for board. They're demanding we surrender unconditionally." Marcus faced an impossible choice. Flight was unlikely to succeed against a faster, more heavily armed vessel. Fighting would result in the destruction of his ship and crew. Surrender meant certain death for everyone aboard, with Isabella's testimony ensuring their conviction for piracy and murder. "There's something else," Isabella said desperately, reaching into her bodice to withdraw a sealed letter. "This was hidden in my cabin aboard the Santa Isabella. I found it only yesterday and haven't had the courage to read it." Marcus took the letter, noting his own name written on its exterior in a hand he recognized. Don Carlos Mendoza's correspondence was distinctive, marked by the careful script of a man who had learned that written words could be as deadly as swords. The letter's contents changed everything. Don Carlos had indeed arranged for his daughter's capture, but not as bait for a naval trap. Instead, he had sought to test Marcus's character, to determine whether the notorious Captain Blackwater Thorne might be capable of transformation into something more than a common pirate. "Your reputation for sparing civilian lives has reached Cartagena," the letter explained. "My daughter carries information that could make you wealthy beyond imagination, but only if you prove worthy of such trust. The Royal Navy's pursuit is real, but it was not arranged by me." Captain Worthington learned of Isabella's capture through his own intelligence network. Hope's warning bark drew their attention back to the approaching warship. The Retribution had closed to within cannon range, her guns run out and crews standing ready. Captain Worthington's reputation for efficiency meant the engagement would be brief and decisive once it began. "Isabella," Marcus said urgently, "the map you showed me, are there hidden passages marked that a ship this size couldn't follow?" She nodded quickly, understanding his desperate plan. "The coral maze near Devil's Triangle, only vessels with shallow draft can navigate it safely." Marcus shouted orders that sent his crew scrambling to catch every breath of wind their sails could hold. The Crimson Tide possessed advantages that no naval vessel could match: intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters and a crew desperate enough to attempt navigation through reefs that had claimed hundreds of ships. The race began as cannon fire erupted from the Retribution's guns, sending iron balls screaming across the water toward their target. The Crimson Tide limped into the hidden lagoon with her mainmast splintered and her hull bearing fresh scars from Royal Navy cannon fire. The Coral Maze had lived up to its deadly reputation, claiming two of the warship's longboats that had attempted pursuit through passages too narrow for their deep keels. Captain Worthington had been forced to abandon the chase, though his parting cannon volleys had reminded everyone aboard the pirate vessel how narrowly they had escaped destruction. The island that sheltered them appeared on no official charts, a green jewel hidden among reefs that had protected it from discovery for centuries. Ancient trees draped with Spanish moss created a cathedral of shadows, while crystal streams provided fresh water that tasted sweeter than wine after weeks of shipboard ration. Hope was the first to leap ashore, her paws splashing through shallow water as she explored this new territory, with the enthusiasm of a creature finally free to run without the constraints of wooden decks. Her joyful barking echoed across the lagoon, a sound of pure happiness that lightened the mood of men who had recently faced death in its most immediate form. Marcus followed his dog onto the sandy beach, his boots sinking into sand so white it seemed to glow in the tropical sunlight. The tension that had gripped his shoulders during their desperate flight began to ease as he realized they had found genuine sanctuary, at least temporarily. Isabella walked beside him, her elegant shoes impractical for beach walking, but her expression showing wonder at the island's untouched beauty. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured, watching Hope chase crabs along the water's edge. "It's like stepping into paradise." Torres supervised the crew's efforts to beach their ship for repairs, but his eyes kept returning to a structure visible through the trees, the remnants of stone walls that suggested human habitation in the island's past. The architecture appeared Spanish in origin, though older than any colonial settlement in the Caribbean. "Captain," Torres called, "you should see what we've found." The ruins proved to be the remains of a small mission. Its chapel roof collapsed, but its walls still bearing carved crosses and Latin inscriptions. A simple wooden cross, weathered but intact, marked what had once been an altar, where long-dead priests had offered mass for the salvation of souls in this remote corner of the world. "Hermit priests," Isabella said softly, translating the faded inscription. They came here seeking solitude and communion with God, away from the temptations and corruptions of civilization. Marcus knelt to examine artifacts scattered among the fallen stones, simple pottery, hand-forged tools, and fragments of religious texts written in multiple languages. These men had lived lives of voluntary poverty and prayer, their only wealth the peace they found in isolation from worldly concerns. Hope sniffed curiously at the ancient cross, her tail wagging as if she approved of this sacred place. The dog's positive reaction seemed to bless their temporary sanctuary, suggesting that even divine providence might smile upon refugees seeking shelter from the storms of human conflict. "They died here," Marcus observed, noting the small cemetery behind the chapel ruins. Simple stone markers bore names and dates that showed the hermits had lived full lives despite their harsh circumstances. Yet they seemed to have found something worth more than gold. Isabella touched the wooden cross gently, her fingers tracing carvings worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. "My father always said that true wealth cannot be stolen or lost through misfortune. Perhaps these men understood that better than we do." The crew established a temporary camp near the ruins, their respect for the sacred space evident in their careful behavior around the chapel remain. Even the most hardened pirates seemed to recognize that some places demanded reverence rather than plunder. As evening approached, Marcus found himself sitting beside the ancient cross while Hope dozed at his feet. The setting sun painted the lagoon in shades of gold and crimson, creating a beauty that no human artist could capture fully. For the first time in years, he felt something approaching peace. Isabella joined him as darkness gathered, her presence comfortable rather than disturbing his contemplation. "What are you thinking about?" she asked quietly, "Those hermit priests," Marcus replied. "They gave up everything the world considers valuable, yet they seem to have found something precious in return." "Perhaps they found themselves," Isabella suggested. "Sometimes we have to lose everything we think we want before we can discover what we actually need." Hope stirred at the sound of their voices, her head lifting to gaze across the lagoon, where moonlight began to silver the calm water. The dog's contentment seemed to reflect the peace that had settled over their small company of refugees, pirates and prisoners, united by circumstances that had forced them to question everything they thought they knew about treasure and value. The ancient cross stood silently among them, its presence a reminder that some sanctuaries endure long after those who created them have returned to dust. The peace of Sanctuary Island shattered 3 days later when sails appeared on the horizon. Marcus recognized the approaching vessel before his spyglass confirmed his worst fears. The Serpent's Wrath, commanded by Captain Diego Bloodhound Martinez, a man whose cruelty had earned him infamy throughout the Caribbean. Martinez had once sailed as Marcus's mentor, teaching him the deadly arts that had made Captain Blackwater Thorne a legend among pirates. Their partnership had ended in blood and betrayal 15 years earlier, when Marcus discovered his mentor's taste for torture and murder extended to innocent civilians. The young pirate's refusal to participate in the massacre of a fishing village had created an enmity that time had only deepened. "How did he find us?" Torres asked grimly, watching the black ship navigate the coral maze with the skill of someone intimately familiar with these waters. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach as understanding dawned. "He knows about this place, because I told him years ago, when we were still partners. I described this island as the perfect hidden sanctuary." Hope sensed the change in her master's demeanor, pressing close to his leg, while her eyes tracked the approaching threat. The dog had never met Martinez, but her instincts read the danger that radiated from Marcus like heat from a forge. Isabella joined them at the lagoon's edge, her face pale with understanding of what this new arrival meant for their fragile peace. "Who is he?" she asked, though Marcus's expression already provided much of the answer. "The worst man I've ever known," Marcus replied quietly. "And once, he was my closest friend." The Serpent's Wrath dropped anchor at the lagoon's mouth, effectively trapping the crimson tide in the sheltered waters that had seemed like salvation. Martinez's crew lowered boats and prepared for landing, their movements displaying the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to violence. The man himself stood prominently in the lead boat's bow, his appearance unchanged by the years since their last encounter. Martinez wore his signature black pearl earring, a trophy taken from the first ship he had ever captured. His beard was streaked with grey now, but his eyes still held the cold cruelty that had made him the most feared pirate captain in the Caribbean. "Marcus," Martinez called across the water, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake preparing to strike. "My old student, hiding in our secret place like a frightened child." The crew of the Crimson Tide automatically reached for weapons, but Marcus gestured for restraint. Martinez had brought 50 men against their 20, and a battle on the beach would result in slaughter rather than victory. Martinez's boat ground against the sandy shore, and he stepped onto the island with the swagger of a man claiming his rightful territory. His eyes immediately found Isabella, and his smile revealed teeth yellowed by years of tobacco and rum. "Still collecting beautiful treasures, I see," Martinez said, his gaze lingering on Isabella in a way that made Marcus's blood boil. "Though I wonder if she's worth the trouble you've caused yourself." Hope positioned herself between Isabella and the newcomer, her hackles rising as she sensed the evil that emanated from Martinez like a stench. The dog's reaction was immediate and visceral, recognizing a threat that transcended normal human conflicts. "What do you want, Diego?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would offer no comfort. "Justice," Martinez replied, his hand resting casually on his cutlass hilt. 15 years ago, you betrayed our partnership and cost me a fortune in plunder. Now I've found you with a prize that will more than compensate for past losses." Isabella stepped forward with surprising courage. "I am not a prize to be traded between pirates like a piece of cargo." Martinez's laughter was harsh and mocking. Spirit, I do enjoy women with fire in their blood. They break so much more entertainingly than the meek ones. Marcus felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler approaching explosion. The thought of Isabella subjected to Martinez's cruelties awakened protective instincts that surprised him with their intensity. Hope's low growl echoed his own feelings, the dog's loyalty extending to both humans she had learned to love. She's under my protection, Marcus said, his voice carrying deadly promise. Anyone who threatens her will answer to me personally. Martinez's eyes glittered with anticipation. Ah, there's the Marcus I remember, the foolish romantic who throws away profit for principle. Tell me, old friend, is she worth dying for? The question hung in the tropical air like the blade of an executioner's axe, demanding an answer that would determine the fate of everyone on the island. Hope pressed closer to Marcus's leg, her presence a reminder that some loyalties transcended calculation or fear. Behind Martinez, his crew spread across the beach with weapons ready, their faces showing the anticipation of men who lived for violence and found joy in others' suffering. The attack came at midnight when the moon was dark and the lagoon lay shrouded in Caribbean shadows. Martinez had positioned his men throughout the ruins of the Hermit mission, turning the sacred space into a killing ground designed to eliminate Marcus and his crew, while preserving Isabella for his own twisted purposes. Hope's warning saved their lives. The dog's acute senses detected the approaching assassins before human eyes could penetrate the darkness. Her urgent whining woke Marcus just as the first blade thrust through the canvas of his makeshift shelter, missing his throat by inches. Marcus roared, rolling away from the deadly steel while reaching for his cutlass. The camp erupted into chaos as Martinez's men emerged from their hiding places among the ancient stone walls. Isabella crouched behind the altar ruins as battle raged around her, her heart pounding with terror and guilt. This violence had been unleashed because of her presence, because Marcus had chosen to protect her rather than surrender her to his former mentor's cruelty. The ancient cross that had offered such peace during daylight now stood witness to bloodshed that defiled the sacred ground. Torres fought beside his captain with the loyalty of 15 years, his blade work efficient and deadly despite the overwhelming odds. But Martinez had planned this assault carefully, using superior numbers and the element of surprise to maximum advantage. The Crimson Tide's crew was being systematically overwhelmed. Hope darted between the combatants, her instincts focused on protecting both Marcus and Isabella. When one of Martinez's men broke through the defensive line and lunged toward Isabella with a poisoned dagger, the dog's intervention proved decisive. She launched herself at the assassin's wrist, her teeth finding flesh just as the blade descended toward Isabella's heart. The poison that coated the weapon was meant for quick, silent death, a concentrated extract from Caribbean tree frogs that killed within minutes. When the assassin's desperate struggle drove the dagger into Hope's flank instead of Isabella's chest, the small wound delivered a dose intended for someone 10 times her weight. "Hope!" Marcus cried, seeing his beloved companion stagger and fall beside the altar. The dog's breathing became labored, her eyes already losing focus as the poison spread through her small body. Isabella crawled to Hope's side, her hands gentle as she examined the wound. "It's deep," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "And there's something on the blade. Poison, I think." Marcus fought his way to them, cutting down 2 more of Martinez's men with savage efficiency. The sight of Hope lying motionless beside the ancient cross filled him with rage that transcended reasons. This sacred place, this innocent creature who had shown him the meaning of unconditional love, Martinez had contaminated both with his evil. "There might be an antidote," Isabella said desperately, remembering stories her father had told about indigenous remedies for various poisons. The hermit priests would have needed medicines for snake bites and other dangers. Their garden might still have healing plants. Torres covered their retreat while Marcus carried Hope's limp form toward the ruins of what had once been the mission's herb garden. Isabella led the way, her knowledge of medicinal plants their only hope for saving the dog who had become the heart of their small family. The ancient garden was overgrown but recognizable, its stone borders still containing plants that had survived decades of neglect. Isabella worked with desperate efficiency, identifying species by moonlight, while Marcus held hope against his chest, feeling her heartbeat grow weaker with each passing moment. "This one," Isabella said, crushing leaves that released a bitter scent. "Mix it with fresh water and force it down her throat. It won't cure the poison, but it might slow its effects long enough for her body to fight back." Marcus administered the crude antidote while battle continued to rage around the mission ruins. Hope's breathing stabilized slightly, though she remained unconscious and desperately ill. Every breath might be her last, but at least she was still breathing. The fight turned when Martinez himself entered the fray, his curved cutlass seeking Marcus's heart with the skill of decades spent in deadly combat. The two former partners circled each other among the ruins, their blades singing through the night air as they settled 15 years of accumulated hatred. "Your precious pet is dying," Martinez taunted as their swords locked at the hilts. "Just like your soft heart will be the death of you." Marcus said nothing, pouring his fury and love into sword work that matched Martinez's skill with desperate determination. Hope lay dying because of his choices. Isabella lived in terror because of his protection, and his crew was being slaughtered because of his refusal to surrender what mattered most to him. The ancient cross stood silent witness to their duel, its presence a reminder that some battles transcend personal conflict to become struggles between good and evil itself. The sea battle that followed rivaled anything in the bloody annals of Caribbean piracy. The Crimson Tide, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the desperation of men defending everything they held dear. Marcus had hoisted a victory flag of his own design, not the traditional black banner of piracy, but a white field bearing Hope's silhouette in gold thread. Isabella's work during their peaceful days on the island. Hope lay in Marcus's cabin, barely alive despite Isabella's herbal treatments. The dog's breathing remained shallow and irregular, though the antidote had prevented immediate death. Isabella maintained a constant vigil beside the small patient, applying cool compresses and forcing drops of water between Hope's lips whenever she stirred to consciousness. The battle above deck raged with unprecedented ferocity. Martinez's Serpent's Wrath commanded superior firepower, but Marcus's crew fought with the unity that comes from genuine loyalty rather than fear. Torres coordinated their defense with tactical brilliance, using the Crimson Tide's superior maneuverability to avoid the worst of the enemy's broadsides. "Hard to port," Marcus shouted from the wheel, bringing his ship around to present her smallest profile to Martinez's guns. Cannonballs screamed overhead, shredding sails and sending splinters flying like deadly rain across the deck. The crew worked with mechanical precision despite the chaos surrounding them. Jenkins emerged from the galley armed with a cleaver and righteous fury, his usual complaints about provisions forgotten in the face of genuine battle. Even Garrett, still bearing scars from his challenge to Marcus's authority, fought with renewed respect for a captain who would risk everything for a dying dog. The Serpent's Wrath attempted to close for boarding, her crew preparing grappling hooks and cutlasses for the hand-to-hand combat that would decide the battle's outcome. Martinez stood at his ship's bow, his black pearl earring catching the morning sun, as he prepared to personally finish what he had started in the island's ruins. But Marcus had learned from their midnight encounter. This battle would not be won through individual heroics or desperate courage alone. Victory required the kind of coordinated effort that only genuine loyalty could inspire, the unity that transformed a collection of pirates into something approaching a family. "Now, Torres," Marcus commanded. The Crimson Tide's hidden advantage revealed itself as concealed gun ports opened along her starboard rail. Marcus had spent months secretly modifying his ship, adding firepower that no enemy would expect from a vessel of her apparent class. The additional cannons spoke with devastating effect, their concentrated fire punching holes through the Serpent's Wrath's hull at point-blank range. Martinez's ship staggered under the unexpected assault, her crew thrown into confusion by damage they had not anticipated. Water poured through shattered planking as the proud vessel began to list heavily to starboard. In Marcus's cabin, Hope stirred at the sound of cannon fire. Her eyes opened for the first time since the poisoning, focusing on Isabella's worried face with recognition and something approaching gratitude. The dog's tail managed a weak wag, suggesting that the worst of the crisis had passed. "She's going to survive," Isabella whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. The fever's breaking. Above them, the battle reached its climax as Martinez realized his ship was doomed. The Serpent's Wrath was taking on water faster than her crew could manage, her guns falling silent as flooding reached the lower decks. Yet the defeated captain's fury remained undiminished by his impending defeat. "If I cannot have victory, then no one shall," Martinez roared, producing a lit fuse that led to his ship's powder magazine. The madman intended to destroy both vessels rather than accept defeat, taking Marcus and everyone aboard, the Crimson Tide down with him. Torres spotted the threat and acted without hesitation. The loyal first mate swung across the gap between ships on a cut-rigging line, his cutlass ready to prevent Martinez from completing his suicidal plan. The two men clashed on the Serpent's Wrath's tilting deck, while both ships drifted toward mutual destruction. Hope's recovery gave Marcus the strength he needed for one final effort. Leaving Isabella to tend the dog, he followed Torres across to Martinez's ship, determined to end their conflict once and for all. The victory flag he had hoisted snapped proudly in the Caribbean breeze, its image of hope serving as inspiration for men who fought not for gold or glory, but for the bonds that made them more than simple pirates. The powder magazine's fuse burned steadily shorter, while three men fought for the right to determine all their fates. Around them, both ships continued their deadly dance across waters that had witnessed centuries of such desperate encounters between honor and evil. 6 months later, the transformed Crimson Tide sailed into Port Royal, flying merchant colors that carried legitimate authority rather than deceptive convenience. Marcus stood at the wheel wearing clothing that marked him as a successful trader rather than a feared pirate, though his weathered hands and alert eyes revealed the dangerous man he had once been. Hope had recovered completely from her poisoning, her coat now glossy with health, and her spirit restored to full vigor. She wore a collar of braided silk that Isabella had crafted during their long voyage back to civilization, its elegant design reflecting her elevated status as ship's mascot rather than simple pet. The dog had grown into her role as guardian and diplomat, her presence serving to ease tensions during the delicate negotiations that had transformed a pirate vessel into a legitimate trading operation. Merchants who might have fled from Captain Blackwater Thorne found themselves charmed by Marcus Castellano, honest trader, and his remarkable companion, who seemed to judge character with uncanny accuracy. Isabella stood beside Marcus at the rail, her hand resting on the simple wedding ring he had crafted from salvaged gold during their weeks at Sanctuary Island. The band bore no precious stones or elaborate decoration, but it represented a commitment that had been forged through shared danger and tested by genuine sacrifice. Their marriage had taken place in the ruins of the Hermit Mission, with Torres serving as witness and Hope as silent participant in a ceremony that blessed unions built on love rather than convenience. The ancient cross had provided the sacred presence needed to sanctify vows exchanged between a reformed pirate and a merchant's daughter who had chosen love over security. The crew had adapted to their new circumstances with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some had taken their shares of the final pirate voyage's profits and departed for other adventures, unable to adjust to lives bounded by law rather than opportunity. But most had remained, finding unexpected satisfaction in honest work that allowed them to sleep without watching for pursuit or betrayal. Torres had embraced his role as first mate of a legitimate merchant vessel, with the enthusiasm of a man discovering his true calling. His experience in Caribbean waters and knowledge of trade routes made him invaluable in their new enterprise, while his loyalty to Marcus remained unchanged by their altered circumstances. The merchant's license that granted them legal status bore official seals from 3 colonial governments, each document representing months of careful negotiation and substantial financial investment. Marcus had used much of his accumulated pirate wealth to establish legitimate trading relationships, purchasing cargo space, and building the reputation that would allow their continued operation. "The harbor master is signaling for us to dock at Pier 7, Isabella observed, consulting the code flags that directed Port Royal's increasingly complex maritime traffic. "That's where the legitimate merchants berth." Marcus nodded, still marveling at the irony of receiving official welcome in a port where his previous visits had required stealth and constant vigilance. The transformation from pirate to trader represented more than a change of profession. It reflected the fundamental alteration of his character that Hope's loyalty and Isabella's love had made possible. Hope bounded down the gangplank as soon as it touched the dock, her enthusiasm for exploration undiminished by the dangers they had survived together. The dog's confidence in their safety reflected the security that legitimate status provided, the freedom from constant fear that marked the difference between criminal and lawful existence. Their first legitimate cargo had been spices and textiles purchased in Cartagena, with funds provided by Don Carlos Mendoza, who had been overjoyed to have his daughter returned safely and impressed by the character transformation her influence had wrought. The merchant's blessing on their marriage had been accompanied by business opportunities that established their trading venture on solid foundations. "Captain Castellano," called a voice from the dock. "Welcome back to Port Royal." The speaker was Governor Harrison himself, a man whose previous encounters with Marcus had involved warrants and pursuit rather than cordial greeting. The governor's acceptance of their new identity reflected the pragmatic attitude of colonial administrators who cared more about profitable trade than past transgressions. Marcus accepted the governor's outstretched hand with careful courtesy, recognizing the significance of official acknowledgement. "Governor Harrison, it's good to be back under circumstances that allow us to contribute to the colony's prosperity rather than threatening it." Hope wagged her tail as the governor leaned down to pet her, her friendly reception of the official suggesting that she approved of their new status. The dog had become a symbol of their transformation, her presence reassuring doubters that the notorious Captain Blackwater Thorne had indeed become someone worthy of trust and respect. The evening found them in the same tavern where Marcus had once planned raids and divided stolen treasures. Now they sat as respectable merchants, discussing cargo manifests and shipping schedules with other traders who accepted them as legitimate colleagues. Hope dozed under their table, content in the knowledge that her family had found peace at last. 2 years of legitimate trading had transformed not just Marcus's life, but his entire relationship with the Caribbean Sea. Where once he had prowled these waters as a predator seeking prey, he now sailed established routes as a respected merchant whose reputation for fair dealing and reliable service had opened doors throughout the colonial trading network. Hope had settled into her role as ship's mascot, with the dignity befitting her status as the creature who had inspired their transformation. She wore her silk collar with pride during port visits, accepting the attention of dock workers and fellow merchants who had heard stories of the remarkable dog who had helped reform a notorious pirate captain. The merchant's license framed in Marcus's cabin represented more than legal authority to trade. It symbolized his complete acceptance into the community of legitimate businessmen who formed the backbone of colonial commerce. The document bore endorsements from governors, harbor masters and trade officials who had observed his operations and found them worthy of trust. Isabella had proven herself an invaluable partner in their enterprise, her education and natural intelligence making her equally comfortable negotiating cargo prices or managing the complex paperwork that governed international trade. Her father's network of contacts had provided their initial opportunities, but their continued success reflected their own abilities and reputation. The Crimson Tide herself had been transformed to match their new identity. Her hull bore a fresh coat of paint that covered the scars of old battles, while her interior spaces had been reconfigured to maximize cargo capacity rather than support combat operations. The gun ports remained, but they were sealed and painted over, their deadly purpose relegated to history. The crew had evolved along with their vessel and captain. Torres continued as first mate, but his duties now involved managing manifests and coordinating with port authorities rather than preparing for battle. His Spanish had proven invaluable in negotiations with colonial officials, while his knowledge of Caribbean waters helped them avoid the storms and hazards that could destroy a trading voyage. Jenkins had expanded his role from ship's cook to purser, his mathematical skills making him surprisingly effective at tracking expenses and calculating profits. The former pirate had discovered an aptitude for honest bookkeeping that served their legitimate enterprise better than his previous talents for intimidation and violence. Hope's own transformation had been equally remarkable. The starving puppy rescued from a harbor auction had grown into a magnificent adult whose intelligence and loyalty had become legendary among Caribbean traders. Ship owners throughout the region knew stories of the dog who could predict weather changes and judge human character with uncanny accuracy. Their current voyage carried a cargo of coffee from Jamaica to markets in Charleston, a routine run that would have been impossible during Marcus's pirate years. The Royal Navy vessels they encountered now offered respectful salutes rather than hostile pursuit, acknowledging their legitimate status and welcoming their contribution to colonial prosperity. Isabella spent much of her time on deck during pleasant weather, her presence a reminder of how much their circumstances had improved since that day when she had been their unwilling prisoner. Hope often joined her at the rail, both females sharing a contentment that reflected the peace they had found in their unconventional family. "The manifest shows we should reach Charleston tomorrow afternoon," Isabella reported, consulting the charts that had become as familiar to her as needlework had once been. "Captain Morrison sent word that his warehouse has space for our entire cargo." Marcus nodded, pleased by the efficiency that had replaced the chaos of their former existence. Legitimate trading required careful planning and reliable execution, skills that had served them well in their transition from piracy to commerce. Their reputation for delivering goods on schedule and in perfect condition had made them preferred carriers for discerning merchants. Torres estimates will clear £800 profit from this voyage, Isabella continued. "Enough to fund the warehouse expansion we've been discussing." The prospect of establishing a permanent base of operations represented another step toward complete respectability. A warehouse in Port Royal would allow them to store goods between voyages and serve as security for the credit arrangements that facilitated larger trading ventures. Such facilities required significant investment, but promised greater profits and enhanced reputation. Hope's ears perked up at the sound of approaching weather, her instincts still serving as an early warning system despite their peaceful circumstances. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but they posed no greater threat than inconvenience and delay, a far cry from the life-threatening emergencies that had once defined their existence. The dog's puppies had been born during their second year of legitimate trading, a litter of 4 that inherited their mother's intelligence and gentle nature. 2 had been given to trusted friends in Port Royal, while the others remained aboard as the next generation of ship's companions. The return to Port Royal brought unexpected recognition in the form of an official ceremony that would have seemed impossible during Marcus's pirate years. Governor Harrison had arranged a formal presentation in the Colonial Hall, where merchants, naval officers, and government officials gathered to witness the presentation of a royal pardon that officially erased Captain Blackwater Thorne's criminal past. Hope walked beside Marcus as they approached the platform where the governor waited with official documents bearing royal seals. The dog wore her finest silk collar for the occasion, her presence serving as a reminder of the transformation that had made this moment possible. Her calm dignity impressed the assembled dignitaries, who had heard stories of her remarkable intelligence and loyalty. Isabella accompanied them in a gown that reflected their new status as successful merchants, her beauty enhanced by the happiness that radiated from her like sunlight. The emerald necklace that had once marked her as valuable cargo now represented the legitimate wealth they had earned through honest trade and careful investment. Marcus Castellano, Governor Harrison announced formally, "By order of His Majesty King George, you are hereby granted full pardon for all past offences against the Crown and its subjects. Your contributions to colonial commerce and your exemplary conduct as a licensed merchant have earned the respect and gratitude of this administration. The assembled crowd applauded politely, though Marcus could see curiosity and amazement in their faces. The transformation of a notorious pirate captain into a respected businessman represented a redemption story that challenged conventional assumptions about human nature and the possibility of genuine change. Torres stood among the crowd in his finest clothes, his weathered face showing pride in his captain's achievement. The loyal first mate had witnessed every step of Marcus's journey from ruthless pirate to honorable merchant, understanding better than anyone the significance of this official recognition. Hope's tail wagged gently as Governor Harrison leaned down to acknowledge her presence. "And you, remarkable lady, deserve recognition for your role in this transformation. Port Royal has never seen such a distinguished ship's mascot." The dog accepted the governor's attention with gracious dignity, her behavior reflecting the training and care that had shaped her into a creature worthy of such formal recognition. Her presence at the ceremony symbolized the redemptive power of loyalty and love that had made Marcus's transformation possible. Captain Morrison of HMS Resolution, the same naval officer who had once pursued the Crimson Tide through Caribbean waters, approached Marcus after the ceremony. His expression showed genuine respect for the man who had once been his most wanted quarry. "Captain Castellano," Morrison said, extending his hand in friendship, "your transformation has been remarkable to witness. The Royal Navy considers you one of our most valuable allies in maintaining order and prosperity in these waters." Marcus accepted the handshake with carefully controlled emotion. The irony of receiving praise from a man who had once sworn to see him hanged was not lost on him, though it represented the complete reversal of his circumstances that Hope's influence had made possible. "Officer Morrison," Marcus replied, "I'm grateful for the Navy's recognition of our efforts to contribute positively to colonial commerce. We found that legitimate trade offers rewards that piracy could never provide." Isabella joined their conversation, her natural grace making her equally comfortable with former enemies and current allies. Her presence reminded everyone of the personal dimension of Marcus's transformation, the love that had provided motivation for abandoning his criminal past. Hope's puppies had grown into young adults during their years of legitimate trading, each displaying the intelligence and gentle nature that made their mother so remarkable. They served aboard various merchant vessels throughout the Caribbean, spreading Hope's legacy of loyalty and wisdom to a new generation of sailors. The evening celebration continued in taverns throughout Port Royal, where former pirates, current merchants, and naval officers shared drinks and stories that bridged the gap between their different worlds. Marcus found himself welcomed into conversations that would have been impossible during his criminal years. Torres raised his mug in a toast that captured the significance of their journey. "To Hope," he said simply, "the little dog who showed us that courage and love can transform even the hardest hearts." The assembled company echoed his words, their voices carrying respect for the remarkable animal who had become a symbol of redemption throughout the Caribbean trading community. Hope wagged her tail at the mention of her name, though her attention remained focused on Marcus and Isabella, the humans who had become her world. As the evening progressed, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The starving puppy he had rescued from a harbor auction had given him something more valuable than any treasure he had ever stolen: the opportunity to become a man worthy of love and respect. 10 years had passed since that fateful day at the harbor auction, when Marcus first spoke the words, "I need a friend, you need food," to a dying puppy. The cottage overlooking Port Royal's harbour bore no resemblance to the rough pirate captain's quarters that had once housed desperate men planning violent raids. Instead, it reflected the comfortable prosperity of successful merchants who had built their fortune through honest trade and careful investment. Hope lay on her favourite cushion near the window, her muzzle now grey with age, but her eyes still bright with the intelligence that had made her legendary throughout the Caribbean. At 12 years old, she moved more slowly than in her youth, but her presence continued to bring peace to the household that revolved around her comfort and happiness. The family portrait that dominated the sitting room showed Marcus and Isabella surrounded by Hope and her offspring, all of them posed in the garden that Isabella had created during their years of prosperity. The painting captured a moment of perfect contentment, preserving the joy they had found in their unconventional family for future generations to admire. Isabella entered the room carrying tea and the gentle manner that pregnancy had brought to her movement. After years of marriage, she was finally expecting the child that would complete their transformation from pirates and prisoners to a legitimate family with roots extending into the future. Marcus sat beside Hope's cushion, his weathered hands gentle as he stroked her graying fur. The years had softened the harsh lines that violence had carved into his face, replacing them with the contentment that comes from meaningful work and genuine love. "Morrison says she's comfortable," Marcus said quietly, referring to the physician who had been treating Hope's advancing arthritis. "But he thinks we should prepare ourselves. Her heart is growing weak." Isabella settled beside him, her hand resting on the slight curve of her belly, where new life grew. The contrast between Hope's declining health and the baby's vigorous movement served as a reminder of life's eternal cycle, the way hope passes from one generation to the next. "She's had a remarkable life," Isabella said softly, watching Hope's peaceful breathing. "How many dogs can claim to have reformed a pirate captain and inspired an entire crew to choose redemption over crime?" The trading business they had built continued to prosper under Torres's capable management, allowing Marcus to spend more time at home caring for Hope during her final months. Their warehouse complex employed dozens of former pirates who had chosen legitimate work over continued crime, each man testimony to the transformative power Hope's example had demonstrated. Children from the neighborhood often visited to hear stories of Hope's adventures, their eyes wide with amazement as Marcus recounted tales of storms survived, battles won, and enemies transformed into friends. The dog's legend had grown with each telling, becoming part of Caribbean folklore that would outlive all of them. Hope's puppies, now adults with offspring of their own, served aboard merchant vessels throughout the colonial trade network. Ship captains competed for the privilege of carrying Hope's descendants, knowing their presence brought good fortune and peaceful voyages. The bloodline had become synonymous with loyalty, courage, and the kind of wisdom that transcends mere training. As evening approached, Hope struggled to her feet and made her way to the garden where she had spent so many peaceful hours. Marcus and Isabella followed, understanding that she wanted to spend her final moments surrounded by the beauty that had marked their years of happiness. The setting sun painted the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, creating a vista that reminded Marcus of countless sunsets witnessed from the Crimson Tide's deck. But this sunset brought peace rather than the anticipation of violence, the satisfaction of a life well lived rather than the restless hunger that had driven his pirate years. Hope settled beneath the orange tree Isabella had planted to commemorate their first wedding anniversary, her breathing shallow but peaceful. Marcus knelt beside her, his voice soft as he spoke the words that had defined their relationship from the beginning. "You needed food," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I needed a friend. We found so much more than either of us expected." Hope's tail managed one final gentle wag, her eyes focusing on Marcus's face with the love that had never wavered despite danger, hardship, and the passage of years. She had kept her part of their original bargain, providing friendship that had transformed not just one man, but everyone whose life she had touched. As the stars appeared over Port Royal's harbor, Hope closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by the love that had made her brief life infinitely meaningful. Her legacy would continue through her descendants, through the men she had helped redeem, and through the story that would be told whenever someone needed to believe that love could triumph over the darkest circumstances.